Welcome to a new installment of History in the Time of Pandemics, the podcast companion to the special issue of the ISIS Current Bibliography on Pandemics, which was released in September 2023 or thereabouts. I am Nirja Sankaran, co editor of the special issue and anchor for this podcast series, through which we hope to foster further communications between various contributors to the issue, even as they and the rest of us continue to grapple with the ramifications not just of COVID 19, but other potential pandemics on different areas of our daily and professional lives. In this episode of the podcast, our focus will be on the bibliographic essays on the very substance or the very meat of pandemics, namely the diseases themselves. One of the essays concerns the disease that caused what was arguably the most famous pandemic incident of the 20th century, the misnamed Spanish influenza pandemic of 1918. The other essay dealt with not one, but a number of unspecified infectious diseases, collectively known as emerging infectious diseases, which may or may not affect us on a pandemic scale. Joining us to discuss these diseases and the lessons they have to teach us about coping with disease outbreaks on different scales are the authors and reviewers of the essays on these topics. Mark Honigsbaum, Matheus Alves Duarte da Silva, and Michael Bresalier. And following a trend from the past episodes of this series, I'll turn the mic over to each one of them in turn so that they may introduce themselves and their role in this special issue. Mark, would you begin?
Yes, thank you for that warm introduction, Niraja. My name is Dr. Mark Honigsbaum. I am a medical historian and a senior lecturer at City University of London. I've written several books on influenza pandemics, but my most recent book was called The Pandemic Century, 100 Years of Panic, Hysteria and Hubris. Came out very shortly before COVID-19 and was rapidly updated that first year for the paperback edition, but events have far surpassed that now. So, thank you for inviting me to this panel discussion.
Matheus.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Niraja, for this introduction. My name is Matheus Duarte. I'm a historian of science. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of St. Andrews, working in the Wellcome Trust-funded project, The Global War Against the Rat and the Epistemic Emergence of Zoonoses. For this special issue, I wrote, as Niraja said, I wrote a chapter, an article with my friend and colleague, Jules Scott-Brow, about emerging infectious disease. And I recently added special issue with Jules, Oliver French, and Frederick Keck on the idea of disease reservoirs, medical anthropology. So thank you very much.
What Matheus forgot to mention is that in addition to being a co-author on his own essay, he served as a reviewer for another essay in this collection by Dora Varga and Imogen Wilkins on vaccinations and pandemic. Michael, would you introduce yourself next, please?
Hello, and thanks for the introduction. I'm Dr. Michael Bresalier. I'm a lecturer in the history of medicine at Swansea University in the United Kingdom in Wales. I'm primarily a historian of modern medicine and infectious disease with particular interest in global health, in something called One Health, which I could say something more about at some point, and zoonoses, infectious diseases that cross between humans and animals. I've recently published a book called Modern Flu, which traces what I call the viralization of influenza from roughly 1890 to 1915. Basically, I'm tracing the process of how influenza was redefined and with what implications as a viral disease that we continue to contend with to this day. That's me.
Could you please add what your particular contribution to the special issue was?
I had the pleasure of reviewing both Mark's and Matheus's contributions. So Mark's contribution on the 1918-19 Spanish influenza, in quotation marks, and Matheus's and Jules's contribution on emerging infectious diseases, both of which were really wonderful to engage with.
Great. Thank you again for joining this conversation. And I'm going to begin with a multi part question for Mark, whose use of the word imaginary in the title of his essay itself conjures up all sorts of ideas, images, and questions for anybody reading about pandemics. What does it cause somebody to imagine? So, before delving into that matter, however, I'd like you to address the issue of the focus of your essay, why 1918 influenza pandemic in particular. The incident was neither the first nor the last major flu pandemic to sweep the world. Flu still visits us annually, and as recently as 2009, and I could be way behind the times about that, it continues to exact a heavy human toll, even though a flu jab does tend to mitigate the symptoms for many of us. There have also been other pandemics in the 20th century itself that claimed as many lives, arguably, as the Spanish flu. And yet, in both scientific circles as well as among the general public, Spanish flu was the major reference point in conversations about pandemics when COVID burst upon the scene. Could you shed some light on why this particular pandemic continues to excite the public imagination and dominate conversations?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question, but I can have a go. So, yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I begin by saying if you go back to the immediate aftermath of the 1918 to 1919, 1920 influenza, you'll see that it didn't have the sort of impacts on the public imagination that we've been led to expect by our own experience, contemporary experiences of pandemics, and the way they are instantly mediatized and become focal points for public health messaging, either for good or bad. There really wasn't much of that in 1918. Post-COVID, I was wondering, is the 1918 pandemic any longer going to be the reference point? But certainly when I was doing my research and writing my histories of influenza and other pandemics of the 20th century, and I'm coming to your question here. So there was a time where the Black Death was the template, right? Most people know about the Black Death because it's been widely mediatized. There are films, there are books, there are documentaries about it. That didn't really happen to the same extent with the 1918 influenza until we approached the 100th anniversary, which, as you know, was in 2018. But the real reason I think it looms so large is because it's been the template for how we understand pandemics in the modern era, by which I mean, the 20th, 21st century, a modern era where we have world trade and we're connected in so many ways that a pandemic on one side of the world, the repercussions are going to be felt elsewhere, especially as it moves around the world. And we saw that in spades with COVID-19. And we saw it with influenza. Again, this is one of the points that gets argued about in the historiography, or the epidemiology. There's one theory that it was just a contingent event that happened to coincide with World War I, in Europe, or that the war itself created the conditions for the emergence of that pathogen. And I think that resonates very much with our own time. And certainly if you immersed yourselves in pandemic planning documents before COVID, and I did this both as a historian and a journalist, because I was interested to see, well, what are the government's plans? They were modeled on 1918, essentially. So I think for that reason, it was natural for people to go back to 1918. Also in 1918, as Howard Markle has shown, there were, we have pharmaceutical interventions and so-called MPIs, non-pharmaceutical interventions. So all that means is, things like social distancing, isolation, or in extremis, a citywide lockdown. So I think for all those reasons, 1918, and simply because of the numbers game, if you, as I set out in my essay, epidemiologists have constantly recalculated, re-estimated the scale of the mortality. It reached its high point with the claim that at least 50 million, maybe 100 million people died. I was glad to see that at last that figures been revised down a little bit, the latest. But people are beguiled by numbers. And when you imagine catastrophic events, as Camus writes, sometimes the imagination can't encompass death on that scale.
I think there's another variable. You ask why the fixation on 1918, and I think we have to blame historians here.
Right.
And you mentioned disaster, and I think Paul Slack a long time ago wrote about our historians' fixation sort of with great disaster history. And I think that's part of it. And you mentioned the scale of it. I think another part of it, it happened. I mean, I think we have to go back to the 70s and 80s, Alfred Crosby's very important book on the American experience, which was framed in 1918 as the forgotten pandemic. And here and now we have a job for historians. And it just happened to coincide with a cultural shift in the historiography towards questions of memory. Why was it forgotten? And you've done some great work on this, Mark, and others have as well. So
thanks for reminding me.
Yeah, and so that's one factor, sort of, the historiographical turn towards memory. But I also think there's a bigger context here, which predates COVID by 30 years, and it ties in with Matheus's concern with emerging infectious diseases, and particularly AIDS. I mean, Crosby retitled his book, in the context of the AIDS pandemic. And, others were looking for other examples. Rosenberg used cholera. Historians were looking for past pandemics to understand what human responses on a broad scale. So I think there's a historiographical story that needs to be told here. And what's happened, I think, over the last 30 years of historical research on 1918 is it's just become an event. And very little attention, and this is where the imaginary thing I think is really important, very little attention has been focused on, you mentioned the legacies, not the legacies, the aftermath. There might not have been sort of a register, a cultural or social register in the immediate aftermath. But in the last 100 years, whenever there's been sort of pandemic threats, whether it's 57 with Asian or it's 68 with Hong Kong influenza, it gets invoked. And I think it's about time for historians to sort of begin to look at the different invocations, the pandemic imaginary broadly construed. I think that ties into the second part of Neeraja's question about your concern with the imaginary. But I think we got to blame a little bit of this on historians. And, we encourage our students to write about the pandemic. Like there's so much more to write about influenza.
The reason why I think the pandemic imagination is a useful placeholder or way of bringing in these different perspectives is I just want to remind you, before we started this chat, I was chatting to Neeraja about one of the most astonishing essays or comments for me at the beginning of the pandemic was Arundhati Roy's essay, Pandemic as Portal. And it sort of captured this idealistic, optimistic sense, which I shared as a historian who had been studying the role of disease ecology and emerging infectious diseases, that finally the world would wake up in a way it hadn't so far woken up to climate change, about, how we're not, our civilization, our systems are not separate from nature, and that we're all very much interlinked. All the stuff that comes out of your scholarship, Michael, and yours, Matheus, on zoonoses and One Health. And the hope was, this was a portal that allowed us to finally examine the system we were living in and imagine a better one.
Any other thoughts on the idea of the portal? That's a fascinating one. I think we need to add it to our bibliography, certainly.
Well, Matheus, I could ask you a question, because what I left out of answering Neeraja about why the 1918 influenza, a big part of the story is the way that science has also brought the H1N1 pathogen into view as an emerging infectious disease. I think this is an area of the scholarship that needs more work. But how do ideas of emerging infectious diseases emerge themselves and get taken up in public health discourses?
Before you get to that really important question, just a second back up and just explain to our audience what this term has come to mean, emerging infectious disease. I mean, I remember I was in science writing school in the 90s when Laurie Garrett's book came out, The Coming Plague, a title. And that's really what brought this issue of emerging infections really into my radar. I'd studied microbiology until then, but not medical microbiology. And I remember Laurie Garrett's book was one thing, and Joshua Lederberg was the other name. These are the two names I can remember, one from science and one from journalism, that sort of really brought this concept to our notice. But I'd like for you to break it down for our audience, please, and then revert to Mark's question after that.
So starting with the more kind of a classic definition of the emerging disease, which is a term that emerged itself in the beginning of the 90s. I mean, you mentioned two actors very important for the craft of this concept, but the other one is Stephen Morse, who was really the person that, in a way, crafted this concept. But the idea of emerging disease, this idea emerged in itself to try to explain why new infectious diseases were appearing, like Ebola in the 70s, but especially AIDS in the 80s, in a moment that just before this moment, in the 70s, there is a kind of a general impression, at least in the West, not in Brazil, but in Europe or in North America, that the infectious disease, they are disappearing. In Australia as well, this is a kind of argument, very famous. And then, in a way, Ebola and AIDS, they shocked, or they in a way challenged this idea. So the concept emerged in really the beginning of the 90s, and the idea of emerging disease means at least three things. One is how a disease appears for the first time, let's say, in history. And then we have with COVID. So it was the first time that, or at least that we know, that COVID-19 became circulating among humans. The second idea of emerging disease is a disease that is already known, but these diseases start circulate among a population that didn't know this disease before. And then to come back to a kind of a historical example, the circulation of smallpox among the Incas or the Aztecas. So smallpox was known among the Europeans, among the conquistadors, but not among the pre-Columbian societies. And the third idea related to emerging disease is the idea of re-emerging disease. So a disease that disappeared or almost was controlled in a given place, and then it reappeared. To stay in Latin America, another good example is the re-emergence of cholera in the 90s in Peru. So Peru, there were outbreaks of cholera in Peru in the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, but then the disease was controlled, disappeared, and then at the end of the 20th century, this reappeared. So we have these three concepts, or the three ideas around the idea of emergence, okay? And in our article with Jules, we try to understand how historians, anthropologists, sociologists, the medical humanists, how they interact with this idea of emerging disease. And we define this in three ways. Maybe there are other ways to interact with the idea of emerging disease, but we listed three ways. The first one would be a kind of, or to tell the history of the emergence of the concept in a kind of a critical way. And then we have the work of King and of Walt, they were classical works to criticize the idea of emerging disease and in a way focus on cultural aspects of the geopolitics of this concept, showing how this emerged in the United States. And this concept shows a sort of panic or fear of the United States vis-a-vis the rest of the world, because the disease in this kind of conceptualization emerged in the tropics. Now, Niraja, you mentioned this book, The Coming Plague, and all the examples of the coming plagues in the plural, they are in Bolivia, in Panama, in Africa, and in sub-Saharan Africa, and so on and so on. And the book and the movie Outbreak, the Hollywood movie Outbreak, is a good example of this idea.
Can I add one thing? Just because I'm conscious that we have a lay audience. And I was just thinking with disease emergence, one thing that was interesting about the concept that was articulated by Morse, and I think you're getting to this, is that it presented a kind of multifactorial explanation for how and why diseases emerge. So traditionally, we would think, oh, a germ causes a disease, and that's why we have, infections, and then why we have pandemics. And they started bringing into different factors like climate change, deforestation, urbanization, all these different factors that for historians, it's like, oh, we've been talking about this for a long time. And there's a sort of a natural segue into contributing to this discussion of emergence. And people like Lederberg even contributed kind of historical perspectives on this. I just was thinking in terms of this concept of emergence, that multifactorial aspect's really important in terms of how it was first conceptualized. It was like really much broader than traditional conceptual, even epidemiological conceptions of disease had been. Correct me if I'm wrong.
No, you are totally right. And I think there is a good dialogue here with history because, and then we have the work of William McNeill, Plagues and Peoples. He was the only historian that was invited in the Congress in this event that, in a way, created the idea of emergent virus. And he had published in the 70s this idea of, or he explained the main pandemic, cholera, plague, and the fall of the Aztec and the Inca empires by this connection of environments. So in the case of the Black Death, is a connection between the environments of Mongolia with the environments of Europe, made possible by the Mongol Empire. The fall of the Aztecas is because of the connection between the environments of what is today Latin America with the environment of Spain, and so on and so on. So yeah, I agree with you in that sense. So the historians, or at least these kind of environmental historians, or avant la lettre, maybe, they were already putting this question, and also Grimek as well. And to cite another, because Mark mentioned this kind of a classic article, I want also to add another article by maybe one of the biggest French historians, Manuel Leroy-Ladurie, who wrote L'unification microbienne du monde. So how the world was connected by microbes. And this is also a very good example of these kind of ecological aspects of history, which was quite new at that moment. And I think the idea of emerging disease, when it emerged, I mean, the concept in a way brought this kind of complexity, as you said, is also, in sometimes is also a kind of dialogue with 19th century kind of a social medicine, because they also put the question of poverty to explain at least the re-emergence of some disease. The case of cholera in Peru is, again, a good example.
Wonderful. Michael, you have something to say?
Can I ask a quick follow-on? I mean, one thing I would be interested to hear from you is how the EID concept, so we have this multifactorial concept, how it gets mobilized in different ways. So, you have the 1992 Institute for Medicine report. In the US, it quickly gets framed as a kind of biosecurity problem. In other places, I mean, I'm thinking of the work by Paul Farmer, sort of say, actually, it's a problematic concept because it's framed like this, but we should frame it as something that is about human rights, about social inequalities. And those are kind of, I mean, they're intersecting but competing. I mean, what's your take on how a concept gets mobilized and put into policy practice, as it were?
Thank you so much. And I think if I can give two examples, and we discussed this in a way, these examples in this article. And the first one is the idea of monkeypox. Monkeypox, in a few years ago, it was framed as an emerging disease because it was the first time that we had outbreaks in Europe, in London, in Madrid, and so on. But this is a disease that's quite well known in Africa, and it was never framed as such. So here we can see this kind of geopolitical inequality, but because it's only when it touched white people in Europe, then it became a problem. But on the other hand, then now to give the example of Brazil, the idea of emerging disease, despite all this very North American centered aspect, it was, and it is used in Brazil in a way, maybe not in the same terms of the United States. And I think in Brazil, this is used to bring the attention towards the re-emerging of disease like yellow fever, a classic disease of Brazil, but also of these new disease that we had, in these new outbreaks that we had in Brazil, like Zika and chikungunya and so on. So I don't think here is only an idea of the United States that is diffused, but this was in a way rework in different contexts with a new kind of aspects.
Mark, did you have something to add to this, or Michael?
Matheus has done an excellent job of covering what is still actually, I think, an under-researched, because if you're looking at the other theme that fed into the emerging infectious disease concept, is very much this idea of biosecurity, which actually, in my reading of it, you can trace back to the CDC's, emphasis on following cases rather than demographic trends. And that's another line where you take the focus as the disease being the threat. And this began with the CDC controlling malaria, actually, in the interior of the United States, and then turning outward, thinking, well, we've dealt with these diseases here. Now, what can we do? And they trained this cadre of epidemic intelligence officers, and that's really where I think there's a big piece here about epidemiology, prospective epidemiology. It goes back to this idea of imagining. It became a point where we wanted to imagine these threats. We'd conquered domestic diseases. We thought that chapter was over, but then it comes roaring back. And I think a lot of those themes that come out of zoonoses and One Health also married up with this idea as epidemiology as a surveillance tool for policing national borders effectively.
Great. Michael, do you have something?
I completely agree with what Mark said. And I think actually the whole sort of history of surveillance and epidemiology, people are starting to work on it. So I think there's some traction there. But my reading of the global surveillance story, it's partly around national interests, but I also think it's around a global imaginary that's emerging. And it's not just about security. It's potentially also about sharing information, global health goods. It's potentially about sharing materials, viruses, and vaccines. So there's a potential here for the rights story to move alongside the security story. I mean, the two are probably related, and they are articulated together, but I just wanted to chuck that in.
Matheus?
Yeah, so I agree with you, Michael, in a way. And then if I can give just one example of this kind of global surveillance even much before the idea of emerging disease, is something that I'm working on it now, is the idea of surveilling rats during the plague pandemic. And because in 1907, there is this first international health organism called Office International d'Hygiène Publique. We forgot sometimes this. We always think that it was the Society of Nations that created this, but there was this first organism based in Paris. And they say precisely like that we need to survey the rats, not to kill the rats, not to destroy the rats, or maybe this as well. This is in 1909, but then comes the First World War, and then this kind of system is only put in place in the 1920s. But the idea of a surveillance of rats, it's there. And they say like that, we need to create a system of surveillance of rats. And I think this is related to this sort of the invention of the global infrastructures that at that moment are still controlled by the Europeans, the French, the British. But the world is brought there somehow. So Brazil and the United States, they are the first members of the office. But then you have the Argentina, Peru, and then Japan. So it's a sort of course, a very European imagination of the world that's being crafted there, which of course comes from the International Sanitary Conference, that the idea of surveillance in a way was there, but the surveillance of the bodies of the pilgrims going to Mecca and being blamed for spreading cholera.
Yeah, no, I think that's a brilliant point, Matheus. And when you say rats, I immediately think of squirrels and the work that both you and I have done on sylvatic plague in California in the 1920s, when Karl Mayer and the Sylvatic Plague Committee, whatever it was called, did precisely this. They went into the hinterland. So, plague in America originally arrives by boat via Hawaii and then San Francisco. It's introduced into America during the third plague pandemic. But then this fascinating ecological exchange takes place between the rats and the domestic American squirrels, who then become reservoirs for plague. And typically, they're on the hinterland of cities or in the hills. And there's this huge effort put into mapping, the hotspots of sylvatic plague as a way of figuring out how to control or exterminate the pest.
I find it interesting that you mention squirrels simply because, one of the plague movies that we watched, or I know The Seventh Seal, the Ingmar Bergman film, has the squirrel, right, chomping up at various points in the film. And so that's been a symbol almost, not quite as long as rats, but anyway, I thought I'd bring that up.
Squirrels are just rats with tails, aren't they?
Bushy tails?
They're cute.
Okay.
I think they're cute rats. Yeah,
I'm sorry. Am I going to get cancelled by the Rat Preservation Society or something? I hope not.
Or the Squirrel Preservation Society. I mean, squirrels were always, and raccoons, they're the cute cousins, I guess, of these other things. Michael, you
Okay.
had something to say, and then I have a question after that.
Yeah, I did. I mean, I'm happy we're onto the animals, squirrels, rats, and other beings. I mean, one of the challenges for us as historians, I mean, global health historians or what have you. I mean, for decades we've looked at human organizations, and that a lesson I learned from Sanjay Bhattacharya was looking at the work of these organizations requires like going into detail. And I guess it's a question more than anything else is how do we want to look at human animal relations here and then bring in the environment, which we ought to, then how do we go about doing that as historians practically to sort of get into the everyday workings? We can say, oh, Meyer went out and did some animal epidemiology, veterinary epidemiology, but the work that goes into that is massive. And then scaling it up, creating a system that is, say, national or international or global in scale. How do we as historians tell those stories without them seeming really facile? Easy, because they're not. Collaboration's a challenge, for instance, between groups, medical, public health, veterinary, with different interests and what have you. So the question is really a kind of pragmatic one around how do we write the history of these kind of interactions, if this is part of what is on the agenda for us as going forward as historians.
Which of you would like to take that bull by the horns?
I'm afraid I don't have an awful lot to add to that. I think a very interesting subject is how living through a pandemic, at least for me, gave me a different perspective on my primary archival material and the sort of questions that I didn't think to ask or neglected to ask.
Okay, so the different things you've said have triggered a few questions, especially with Michael saying it was in a way, the historian's fault. And, that sort of raised the issue for me because it's the first time, actually, I think, in any podcast in this series, definitely, and in any podcast that I've probably done, this question of fault. We're all historians, and so we're always trying to talk about how important history and our work as historians is. And especially, there was a critique, right, about all these people getting together, the epidemiologists, the scientists, but not as much to historians. So, what value do historians bring to this picture? How much can we, should we, could we contribute to these larger conversations about dealing with pandemics? And related to that, how can longue durée historic perspectives better inform our responses? So, the role of historians and the longue durée perspectives, those are the two questions we'll go to first, and then come in on economic political impact.
I wasn't really blaming historians, and I just wanted to sort of speak to that because I think there is an issue though that you're raising here, which is about what is the responsibility of the historian. And
Exactly.
it's a vexing question. I mean, it was at the recent European Association for the History of Medicine. There was a plenary with some very eminent historians, Warwick Anderson, Jeremy Green, Dora Varga, among others, who were taking on this question, and it proved to be very challenging. What is the responsibility of a historian in the context of an epidemic or a pandemic? That's a big question, and I think fixating on one is problematic. That's what I was getting to. But I just wanted to sort of correct that. I think there is a really interesting question about the ethics. And I think that ties into the second question that you were asking, which is what do we focus on? Which was, have we focused enough on the socio and economic? I think that's Mark was raising that question. Are there other things that we need to consider? We've talked about sort of issues of right. So I'll hand over now. When I was it wasn't blame, it was about sort of responsibility. I mean, I'm being a bit tongue in cheek here, but
I realize I just used it as a way to open up the conversation because sometimes we're just too gung-ho about what we do, and maybe we need to ask ourselves what questions we're not asking and what we should be asked. I mean, we want to be taken more seriously and insert ourselves because we have I don't think it's too much to say, too much of a claim to say that we as historians have something useful to offer in the here and now. But exactly how do we bring together these other fields and people to realize that it's if we keep talking amongst ourselves, it's not going to happen. So I think, whether or not we call it blame, I think my taking it that way was to open the conversation up. So thank you.
Thank you, Narasha. So I think your original question is, what do historians have to say? How would we have maybe managed the response to the pandemic differently is the bigger question. I mean, it's the question I ask myself all the way through. So I think we've shown that in the special collection. The best example is the social history perspective. And this is what was absent from most pandemic planning, at least in the UK and I think also in the United States. If you look through those plans, people anticipated impacts on business, the disruption to retail and trade and the necessity to make childcare provision for working women. So, bank tellers wouldn't stay home. But the side that didn't really get into those documents was how pandemics are like accelerants and, actually do impact different social groups, ethnic, racial, and class groups in different ways. So the whole insight from health inequalities didn't find its way into pandemic planning. And there was no mention, for instance, of social distancing in any of the pandemic plans I saw. And lockdown was not even a term people considered. So this goes to the second part of your question. And, if I reflect on my own insights, and, the pandemic was a wake-up call for me as well as a historian, because, I had written a book most recently framing it all in the modern era, which I dated from the First World War, the Spanish flu. So it was about modern pandemics. And when I first saw those scenes from Wuhan of hospitals being built overnight and these huge A&E anti-waiting rooms with all these cots lined up, I immediately thought of this iconic photograph from 1918, which has been interpreted as a picture of the first wave of Spanish flu that erupted supposedly at Fort Riley in Kansas, Camp Funston. And you see this picture of all these army recruits laid out on cots, in much the same way we saw those scenes in Wuhan. So that was the first wake-up call. But the biggest wake-up call was when China locked down those cities. My immediate reaction was, oh, this can't happen here. This will never happen. I couldn't conceive of what they're going to put a ring of armed military around the M25 and stop people driving up and down it. But of course, that's not what we got. We got a sort of what I call like a Boris light lockdown that was unevenly policed and patrolled. Of course, other countries in Europe and France, they were much stricter. But in order to make sense of that, I found myself reaching back to, well, what is the literature on lockdowns? And there is a big literature on quarantines, right? There was a very sophisticated system of surveillance and quarantining. But, we don't have examples of community-wide or city-wide unless you reach right back in time. So I think this is where another theme of the special collection, the Annals School of History, the longue durée view. So I feel I was guilty of just looking at the last 100 years. The historian's real role is to step out of, the present and the last 10 or 100 years and really be able to reach back to, because what we discovered during COVID was communities, people found their own ways of actually making sense of this threat while continuing, to interact. And we saw this in myriad different ways wherever we were locked down, right? So this phenomenon of suddenly having a new sense of space and time, of one's connectedness to neighbors. Suddenly, you didn't have the roar of traffic and you could hear the birds twittering in cities again. And I think that this is quite a profound insight for me, that we really need better histories of quarantines and what medical anthropologists call people's science, which we also saw in epidemics of Ebola, for instance, in West Africa, where people spontaneously acted in ways that drew on a deep cultural knowledge, actually.
Michael?
I mean, I think Mark's hit on a number of really important themes and issues. I mean, one thing that kind of crops up for me is what history for whom? We as academic historians have a certain toolkit that we draw upon, sort of contextualist, maybe loosely constructivist or around framing, what have you. Maybe we look at social determinants of health and disease. Is that what a policymaker, is that the kind of history that a policymaker would want? Maybe, but not necessarily. So there's different histories to be produced. And, policymakers, organizations have their ideas about what counts as history, and they write their histories. So we have multiple kind of pandemic histories, not just one set. And this collection shows that very clearly. But we poo-poo like insider histories or, sort of Whiggish histories, whatever. But that's still what I think a lot of people in government or international organizations want to have. And how do we sort of move into that territory and sort of bring in to sort of ask more broadly contextualist questions, I guess, is one thing. I don't think there's a really simple answer to that. And there's some places where Mark mentioned the issue of, we didn't talk much, or you didn't see much evidence of in the UK of talk of inequalities. There was tons of talk of inequalities, but historians weren't the people. Michael Marmot, Richard Horton, editor of The Lancet, they were all talking about how this is an equal opportunity killer. Lots of people were, but our research wasn't sort of something that was turned to. It wasn't immediate enough, I don't think. And do we need past examples to say that there's inequalities? There's inequalities. So I think it's really challenging for us to sort of put our foot in the door, as it were, into, you asked the question about policy in a way and policy making. I think there's a challenge in terms of the kind of history that we're producing for our peers and our own audiences, which is a kind of critical history, and the kinds of histories that might be of interest to other and even useful in a way. I mean, can we make the kind of work that we do useful in a way, but we're going to have to make adjustments. I mean, the historian Virginia Barrage, who written great stuff on smoking and on AIDS, once said this to me. I mean, she was involved in a lot of, but she had to shift her history according to the audiences she was writing it for, and then negotiate those terms. So I think there's practical challenges in doing that.
Maybe we should get together and do that. What can historians bring to the table?
Matheus?
Actually, I would like to bring more another kind of example or discussion for these points, how we historians, we can try to engage with politics and pandemics in the present moment. So as I said at the beginning, I don't consider myself a historian of medicine. I prefer to say I'm a historian of science. So what interests me is the production of knowledge about health and medicine. And the history of science, in the way that was structured, in at least since the 80s, is very micro studies. By micro can be 50 years, 60 years, but we historians of science, we don't do too much this kind of longue durée, especially in a kind of a Brodelian version, like 300 years, 400 years. We don't do this, or it's not possible. I'm not saying that's impossible to do. Thomas Kuhn did this in a kind of longue durée way very well, but we don't do this, or at least I don't do this. So what interests me, it was much more the controversy, and the controversy are usually quite limited in time, even if it can be decade. During the pandemic, I was finishing my thesis, and my thesis was about the production of vaccines and sera against plague. So during the beginning of the third plague pandemic, and how a sort of a circulation of knowledge emerged between Brazil, India, and France. I still need to publish my thesis, but I wrote in French, and now I'm trying to publish it in English. So anyway, and I think the example of the production of the vaccines, the first anti-plague vaccines, is a good example to, in a way, dialogue with the public in our present times. Not to say that we take the example of the anti-plague vaccine to make the COVID vaccine. There's nothing related with these two vaccines. But I think showing how unstable, how complex it was to not only to create the vaccine, but to evaluate and to prove that these work during the times of plague, in a way, I think it's a good dialogue, not to teach someone, but it's just to give an example to show the complexity of the emergence in this sense of a new vaccine. And we could see this during COVID and all the debates about vaccines. This is not to deny the value of science, of the production of vaccines, but just, I think, it's to highlight the complexity, a social, technical kind of complexity that are woven around these objects.
Well, I think, Matheus, you made a really crucial point around the production and circulation of knowledge or a material object like vaccines, if you want to call a vaccine a material object. My question to you would be, I've been very interested for a while about how to tell both global and also longer durée, long-term histories, but while also attending to, the everyday practices of producing knowledge or things. So how do you do? And in a way, the story that you tell about plague vaccines, could you not tell both a local and a global story there? I mean, even just the problematic of production and circulation. I mean, that's a characteristic of pretty much any, vaccine system of the last 150 years or so. Maybe that's not too long. Maybe we want to go back to like smallpox and Jenner, but even there, production and circulation are there thematics that we can use to accumulate local stories to produce ones that are global in their analysis and in their consequence?
No, thank you so much. And I think if I can give the example of the anti-plague vaccine, because my idea of the global history, I try to interact with global history a little bit like Carlo Ginzburg said. It's a kind of a micro history, a global micro history, if we can say like that. So not like William McNeill or Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie. What I do, and I did with the plague vaccine, is to put this in the micro and follow the circulation that was global. So my example is in 1922, that's the first centennial of the Brazilian independence. It's the beginning of a discourse that the anti-plague vaccine is the beginning of the Brazilian science. Okay? But actually what I try to show in my doctoral thesis, this is just one of the examples that I study in my thesis, that this vaccine that was created in Brazil in 1901 actually is a kind of a hybrid of vaccines. The anti-plague vaccine invented by Valdemar Rifkin in Bombay, and by other vaccines are invented especially in Italy, and that were physically brought to Brazil by an Italian doctor called Camillo Terni, and how these emerged. So actually it was a very global history, the emergence of this vaccine that became a sort of herald of the Brazilian microbiology. So there is a kind of very national discourse, but actually the background of this vaccine is a global. It's not a longue durée because the history of the anti-plague vaccination starts in 1896, but it's global, not seen as God or as a ET, but through the point of view of these vaccines circulate around the world. And just to come back to the special issue, this article that I had the pleasure to revise, written by Dora Varga, and I think it is a good example of this, showing how the problems of vaccination, they were global. And we have this circulation of practices of health officers and also the objects, but through the point of view, a very material point of view, which is the vaccine itself and the practice of vaccination.
Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on something right at the start when Matheus reminded me that, there is another thing that historians, certainly historians of science and technology, bring to these debates. And that is to be cautious of reifying any one scientific discipline over another. So this for me was a lot of our scholarship or our historical interest in pandemics starts with epidemiology. Epidemiology makes these visible, but they also, in a sense, write the histories of those before we come along with our particular humanities perspectives. But if we talk about science, one thing that when I conceived my book, The Pandemic Century, it was after having spent several years on a Wellcome Research Fellowship looking into the history of disease ecology and how ideas of disease ecology emerge, right, from dialogues across disciplinary boundaries. So I think that's one very important perspective. But the other, even more fundamental one, is what historians of science can say is like, yes, science has brought us all these incredible vaccines and medical therapeutics, etc. But, how does science itself produce this knowledge? What are the gaps in the knowledge? What is it we don't know, right? And what is it we know we don't know? So we're getting into Rumsfeld's famous definition of different types of knowledge. But of course, what we saw is when a pandemic hits and you're a populist leader wanting to hang on to your majority as you bumble through a pandemic, the vaccine is a savior, right? And we've just seen a report this week that, there were concerns about some of the vaccines. And the RNA vaccines were completely untested technology. Of course, the vaccine that got the most heat was the AstraZeneca vaccine, which was using a very well-established chimp adenovirus as a delivery, and the whole point about it was a live virus, which we know produces stronger immune responses. But the perspective we bring as historians is like, well, we just deconstruct that science and say, there's all sorts of things in vaccines that we know work based on population-wide trials, but we don't always know precisely why they're effective or how they're effective, even what the mechanism is. This is why we add all sorts of adjuvants to vaccines. So all of that stuff gets black boxed, at least in times of pandemic, but generally. And I think this is where we bring real value. But this is really the challenge, because it's a very unpopular message to be saying, careful about this particular science. It's paralyzing in a way in an emergency, isn't it? But I think these are very important perspectives that we bring to this field. I think one of the things that makes medical history unusual among the humanities, besides environmental historians, is that, we actively have a dialogue with medical science. And some of the most valuable discussions I have are with some of the top epidemiologists and vaccinologists, immunologists, who also have an appreciation of the history of their discipline and are often, quite good historical scholars themselves.
Before you jump in, Michael, I just wanted to say there's also something you said also raised this issue of historians. When we talk about science and technology, yes, there's vaccines, but there's also dangers, right? I mean, dangers and unlooked at areas such as the behavioral sciences. I mean, there was a lot of pushback and resistance against doing behavioral research during the AIDS pandemic, early years in America, especially in North America, where any proposal for a study of looking at sexual habits was completely shut down. I mean, Reagan has a lot to answer for, or had. But in any event, there were all these issues. But I just thought, even within science, history of science, what science brings is often just one compartment. I think also needs to realize that within science is not monolithic. I think we as historians of science and technology take that sort of for granted, but I think we shouldn't expect that everybody takes it for granted, and we kind of need to show that there are scientists and people who say that vaccines cause autism need to be dealt with. Michael.
Actually, that ties into exactly what I wanted to bring up. As historians, even of science, let's get away from the scientists. I mean, you mentioned AIDS. I mean, what drove AIDS science, at least in the US, but also in Brazil and other parts of the world, were not scientists, it were activists who possessed certain types of and acquired certain types of expertise. And if we only are paying attention to what's happening in labs or in policy rooms, then we're missing whole constituencies of knowledge producers and consumers and users. And this, I mean, if we're going to tell stories of pandemics, we need to tell stories from, the old term, the patient's perspective, and bring those in. And, anti-vaccination might be one thing, but that's really a small minority of the ways in which vaccines get taken up. I mean, vaccine hesitancy is a very interesting phenomena. I mean, I was hesitant getting my kids and myself vaccinated with AstraZeneca because we were guinea pigs, but I was kind of happy to be a guinea pig. And, the story of people choosing to become guinea pigs, people producing particular types of knowledge or understandings of pandemics, within communities, within networks or what have you, that are not within, the hallowed halls of the NIH or the CDC. We really need to bring those into view to get a rich picture of, responses, uses of, engagements with scientific knowledge, and maybe think about it as kind of, this is popular now in the social sciences and even humanities, in terms of the co-production of knowledge, the co-production of science. I think the history of science, historiography of science and of medicine has really moved away from just looking at, white men in lab coats in labs. I'm guilty of doing that in my book. But I think going forward and thinking about going forward, we really need to sort of bring those voices in.
I think everything you've been saying is really important. But there's another aspect of this that I think we should address, because it's something that's worried me. Before we began this conversation, I chatted to Niraja about, she studied under Frank Snowden. And I remember I was right at the start of COVID. It was just one of those accidents of timing. His book, Epidemics and Society, was updated and released. He has quite a quixotic historical take on that, but it's very accurate in public health terms. But one thing it doesn't address, and this has long been my frustration with all medical histories of pandemics, it doesn't really engage, I think, properly with the history of social and political change, with few exceptions. Obviously, around HIV/AIDS, where activists were very central, and it was it coincided with the emergence of identity politics. But in broader economic social terms, one thing that was the reason the 1918 pandemic was labeled forgotten by medical historians, including myself, after Crosby, is that it didn't seem to have these major impacts, economic impacts, or impacts on institutions. So we know that cholera transformed sanitation and public hygiene. It was harder to see the influenza pandemic having those sort of changes. You can draw out threads, did it contribute to the pressure for the foundation of the NHS? It certainly led to the establishment of a Ministry of Health, for instance, in the UK. This is something both Michael and I have written about. But if you're thinking in broader terms, did it affect major political changes? I was always very skeptical of that. Of course, the book that Laura Spinney brought out made quite a strong case for its wide cultural and other impacts. So there has been some revisionism there. But asking this question right now, I think historians need to start asking this question right now. What impacts, if any, has the pandemic had on social and political currents? I can see how it's amplified them at times. I think you could make the case that the migrant crises that we're seeing both in the UK, but also on the long land border that the United States shares with Mexico, is partly a product of the pandemic, because in the advanced nations, we have a workforce crisis now, with people too unwell or infirm, either from long COVID or the mental health impacts and stresses that went along with the pandemic. But how can we disentangle that from all the other crises that supervened? So that brief moment of hope and optimism about this is a chance to reset and reconsider our relationship with nature and understand how we are part of the environment, and it's not it's just not one thing doing this to us. It's the way we put pressure on these natural habitats and increase the risks that these diseases will cross from animals and somehow get up and running in human populations. But beyond that, do pandemics change history? We had the 1918 pandemic in the literature. One reason why it was forgotten is it was overshadowed by World War I, even though it came just at the end of World War I. But in our own time, how rapidly has COVID-19 been overshadowed by the wars in Ukraine and now Gaza, right? I think we need to sort of engage more broadly with the idea of medical history, not just within its own field of medical institutions and public health systems.
Matheus, you had a comment, and then I'd turn it over to Michael.
It was quite a small comment based on what Michael was saying, that of the kind of a resistance against vaccines. I think this is a kind of a famous subject when we discuss history of science and pandemics. And I'm from Rio de Janeiro. We had the biggest rebellion, civil rebellion in Rio de Janeiro was the rebellion against the smallpox vaccination called Revolta da Vacina, so the vaccine rebellion. The city of Rio was bombed in 1904 by the Brazilian Navy. So no jokes with that. But I think sometimes we exaggerate, or not exaggerate, but we focus too much on this idea of the resistance. And actually, we forget that there is also, and we can see this with COVID, a lot of acceptance. And Brazil is also a good example because, contrary to the UK, where Boris Johnson really played with the vaccine, in Brazil, Bolsonaro was against the vaccine. Then there was a lot of movements, social movements, try to force him to buy the vaccine or to give money to the Brazilian institutions to produce vaccine. So there's also movements of acceptance, and this also explains the history. Maybe as historians we can also focus on these moments of why people they rebelled. This also happened, and this is quite maybe it's more interest to say about the rebellion that the city of Rio is bombed rather than people of Rio de Janeiro accepting for instance, the anti-plague vaccination. They were very happy to accept this just before the vaccination against smallpox. So anyway, it was more a kind of a thought about how we historians sometimes, we dialogue what you said. There's also some kind of historians' fault here. Sometimes we insist too much in one aspect, and I think we forget other kind of aspects. And I think the vaccination is just one example of this.
I think that's a really important point. I mean, in terms of thinking of future directions or what have you. I mean, one thing that I kind of made a point of the few little contributions I made during the pandemic is like, can I emphasize something that is about collaboration, about people getting together, about acceptance, rather than about resistance? Because that's sort of been, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the historiography of medicine and even science, but certainly the historiography of medicine is one about various kinds of resistances to X, Y, or Z. And it's much harder to talk about acceptance, the incorporation, use. I mean, how do you go about doing that? As you said, I mean, the history of science has one methodology is about controversy, not about cooperation, not about acceptance. I think that's a really important point. I wanted to get to what Mark was saying about impacts, because I mean, how do we judge, how will we assess the impacts of COVID-19? And I was thinking, I teach a second year history, or third year actually, history of epidemics module, of course, and we always have plague, and we use Paul Slack's short introduction because students won't read very much, and they don't. As the years go on, less and less. I mean, might be just snippets, but I mean, the thing that always struck me when I was expecting, because I'm not a plague specialist as Matheus is, but expecting, like the second plague is going to be transformative. It transformed Europe. And the upshot of his analysis is, if you look at it in terms of demographic terms, the changes were slow and incremental. If you look at it in cultural terms, there's a backdrop of cultural change, and change varied across, from place to place, and it was slow and it was not as dramatic. Economics, okay. Economic impacts in terms of, salaries going up because the number of people available to work are diminished, so the smaller labor pool, people can. So I guess the point that he makes is that the impacts are not necessarily so readily apparent, certainly in the first couple of years after the Black Death. I mean, he does do a longue durée, and they take a long time to become apparent, if they even do. And there's unconscious or subconscious or things that just reside in private memory. And I mean, there is a collective memory around the pandemic, that pandemic. But I think in a way, if we want to think about impacts of COVID, I mean, how do we start sort of resourcing this? You've been doing that a bit, Mark, I know. People are archiving the pandemic. Are they continuing to do so? But, I think in a way, it's when we're long dead, at least me, maybe that kind of perspective will be able to be generated.
Can I very quickly jump in a very short point? I think one of the challenges that we face, I mean, you say I've been documenting it, but actually after the first year, I kind of gave up. I mean, we have a particular challenge because historians today have such an overwhelming volume of data. How do you make sense of all that noise? And of course, after my book, the pandemic hit, my publishers were urging me to write another book. But there was never a point in the pandemic, even now, if we can say it's over, it's not over, but we're out of the critical crisis phase. Even now, I don't know what the coherent narrative might be or what the analysis I can see microanalysis, but something that encompasses, and I get sent nearly every book that's come out on the pandemic. And they all suffer from the same problem in that it feels like Groundhog Day when you read it. And no, it does, literally, because there's nothing new or surprising. They might go into the mask controversy or, the way Japan and different cultures, but we kind of discovered all this as we went along. There is actually one very good social history called Fatal Breath by a social. I think social historians really were the best placed, but historians of science, people interested in longer durée time frames, or political scientists have written instant books examining. I think the challenge for medical historians in the future will be synthesizing all of this and then teasing out, which effects are just contingent effects of the pandemic. I mean, what I saw going on really is that pandemics, and I think this is one of the most valuable perspectives I haven't mentioned, but an Alves school, or what we might call an emotionological approach, or even cultural approach, pandemics tend to draw on pre-existing social and cultural materials. So a best example of that is the Black Lives Matter movement. So, of course, there were protests about police shootings of unarmed black men before. But the combination of that really shocking video and everyone sitting at home at the same time, not at work, seeing that, created a way for that to spontaneously spill out and become the big movement it did. But then my historical question is, what happened to the demands and insights of that movement engendered, that activism that seemed to have been engendered by the experience of COVID, which killed black people disproportionately, right? In the same way that white police officers were disproportionately targeting black people. So you saw those metaphors playing into those political movements. But then everything returned to normal, the normal oppressive and structural inequalities as before. And I think it'll take a long time to tease those threads out, basically.
Michael, do you want to make one last point and then?
Very quick. I think a part of this is what kind of questions do we want to ask, and what kind of problems or phenomena do we want to explain? And one book by Peter Baldwin, I mean, he has a kind of tried and tested method, right? He basically does comparative analysis of different sort of policies in different countries, and he produced something very quick and dirty, not groundhoggy, about the first year of the pandemic. But the concept that he's working with, and I think it's useful for historians, is to think in terms of path dependency. If we're interested in policy and how sort of approaches are taking, and it ties in with what Mark was just saying. Sort of every response to a pandemic is a background history. There are reasons why their decisions were made, whether the modeling had to do with modeling the wrong disease like influenza or what have you. But one job that we can do, I think, in the immediate present is to think about, how we got to where we got to in terms of responses. And secondly, and this is something that some other historians raised, what were the conditions that made it possible for COVID to emerge? Which gets to Matheus, there's the Wuhan, we have the virus escape, but are there political, economic, social, globalization factors that we as historians can begin to track, to look at the phenomena of emergence that's specific to COVID? And we can actually provide powerful perspectives, I think, on those material conditions that gave rise to this particular pandemic, without making recourse to the lessons that 1918, plague, or cholera can teach us.
That's a wonderful point for us to end on. I mean, this conversation could go on forever, and I hope it does off air. But thank you all very much for your time and this wonderful conversation. This is Nirja Sankaran, and this has been a podcast from the Consortium of History of Science, Technology, and Medicine in Philadelphia, based on the special issue of ISIS Current Bibliography. Thank you all.